Hello everybody. Today we're actually going to talk about Active Directory domain services and some of the things that extend it. Our goal is to talk about the ideas of Active Directory domain services, give you a little bit of background, and as well as talk about extending it, get some of the new concepts that are out there so that we can really help you and your company do the best on your domain services. So Managed Solution was founded in 2003. I actually came on board in 2009. We have really old numbers on this slide because this has maintained 100,000 plus assets for over 1,500 businesses. The reality is that there are many, many more because I have just one client with over 100,000. I've worked on another client with significantly more, the normal stuff. But let's actually get back into this and roll into our domain services overview. So I wanted to make sure that everybody understands there's a lot of history and a lot of myth about Active Directory and Windows. Everyone's always thinking that everything is pure Microsoft. And you know what? It's not. So historically, Active Directory is based off X500 or LDAP. Now these are old concepts. However, if you look here, you see a bunch of RFC numbers and a date after them. So RFC 1823 was from 1995, RFC 2307, 1998. These are actually public discussions that happened of talking about the X500 standards, the LDAP standards, and what actually became Active Directory. So there's a little bit more background there. It is not just here Microsoft came with this great idea. It's the whole world was involved in reality. So the idea behind Active Directory, though, is to govern identities. So why do we govern identities? To lower our total cost of ownership. In the old days, every computer you had its own username and password for that user or for the computer in its entirety. It could be either one. Or in some cases, there was no usernames, no passwords, no nothing. You just had to get your hands on the keyboard and you were good to go. This was not something acceptable to business. I can't say that your money is safe if anyone can log in. It just isn't the case. So the identity management and controlling of access actually became a really big thing back in the 90s. Today, we all know it is one of the highest importance in a company. We have to have that security. So once that actually went through, and actually grew, then we started looking at how do we extend it. So originally it was like, well, we'll give you a trust relationship. And in the old days, it was really common for businesses to have a trust between two domains over a network connection, maybe a lease line, something like that. These are really common. But now it's your applications are in the cloud. So cloud integration is something that's a really big deal. This is something that Active Directory has grown with. If you remember back there, it actually had some in the mid-2000s for those RFCs. That's because Active Directory is still a growing entity. It's not something that's stopped. So today we have tools like Workday that actually write back to Active Directory. So you can integrate and go two ways, not just one way. Okta. It's really common to run into Okta provisioning users into Active Directory and then using Active Directory authentication to approve utilizing tickets. So cloud integration is fully integrated. I mean, it's fairly seamless, actually. And it's part of the entire concept behind this. So I want you to look at this slide. This slide is a concept of cloud extending. Now, when you're getting your Active Directory to the cloud, understand that you're not looking at only where your servers are. You're looking at where your people are. And in this picture, if you notice, the servers are actually not in the same location as the end users, because that's really how it works. Even if you're a traditional company, you often will have your domain controllers in another state or even another country. And you're doing that authentication over connections, either VPN, MPLS, lease lines. It doesn't matter, but you're extending to the cloud. Office 365 is the preeminent. Most people say, yeah, well, I don't really use cloud apps, but I do have my email in the cloud. And you ask them what email. Quite often it's Office 365, which is way more extending than I think most people realize. So if you look here, there are so many options for identity and access management using Active Directory and connecting to Azure Active Directory. You've got dynamic groups. You've got SSO, MDM. I mean, if you look at this picture on things you can do connecting, it all starts with Active Directory. So understand that we have a lot of communication going. If you notice, their arrows are going multiple directions. They're doing that on purpose because those really do impact each other. Changes how business runs today, actually. So 9 times out of 10, when I go to a client, they may have 2012 domain controllers, but in reality, they're still running on like 2003 or 2008, or in some cases 2000. So what do we really get out of modern versions of Active Directory domain services? Well, the first off is everybody's had this idea for years and years. We've managed our resources by security groups. Now, security groups are great. They are incredibly important. They are not, however, the creme de la creme for everything. In modern versions, 2012 to 2016, there's a new concept out there called dynamic access control. The idea is that security memberships and groups tend to follow people. Well, when you follow people and you actually give these access rights and capabilities, it ends up with people having way too much access, because I may have started in the file room, but now I am a senior manager. But every step of the way, my groups followed me. Now, at one point, maybe I ran the PMO. Maybe I ran another team. Maybe I have access to things that I shouldn't have. That's a real common problem, especially for companies that actually have that longevity. I've been to companies where it's been generational. People literally have their kids and their kids' kids working at the same company. And I literally have seen someone go from the mailroom to a senior manager position. So when you look at their security rights, sometimes things were removed when they moved from one position to another. Sometimes they weren't. The idea behind dynamic access control is to stop that type of thing from happening. You identify the type of user. You identify objects and pieces that build the rights, that do it dynamically instead of by groups. So it stops human error. And then there's the piece that a lot of people miss, and that's the old Active Directory concept with FRS, File Replication Services. Now, DFS, Distributed File Systems, is significantly faster, significantly safer. It doesn't have the types of errors like journal wraps that are common in FRS. But you actually have to migrate it separate from the domain controller. So I can install a 2016 environment, but if I'm connecting it to a domain controller that was 2003 at one point, and I don't upgrade to DFS, all of a sudden I don't actually have all those extra capabilities, those extra speed, that extra reliability. So I strongly recommend that people take a look at that. That is very commonly missed. Alrighty, so I've actually talked here about concepts up there at the top. Let's talk about the stuff on the bottom half of the screen. All right, does everybody here know that AD Domain Services in 2012 was the very first version that actually truly supported virtualization? There are lots of things that can go wrong on a domain controller that historically have doomed domain controllers. 2012 actually gave the ability to deal with those incidents, those errors, those mistakes. We're going to go into that a little bit longer later, but I just want you all to think about that. That really only happened in 2012, and that doesn't matter what version of hypervisor you were using. 2012 actually put a GUI on the recycle bin for Active Directory. What that means is if you have the recycle bin enabled, you can actually click and say, I want to undelete this user that was accidentally deleted. Great for auditing purposes. Just going to say it's great for error recovery. Active Directory restores are a nightmare. We all know this. This avoids it. And lastly, 2012 brought out the new concept of group managed service accounts and managed service accounts. Now, what that basically means is you can manage a service account from Active Directory. It will create its own password that you never type, and it will change it regularly, every 30 days, with a hideously long, over 40 character long, random character string for a password. No one can ever use it. You can't log into it. But you can actually manage your services with accounts that are now about as secure as possible. So I just want to make sure everybody knew about that. There are many types of managed service accounts, or should I say service accounts, because most of us have used service accounts for years and years, and that basically means it's the thing that you say, hey, don't change the password on that, it'll break all sorts of stuff. So once again, human error is a major component we're trying to avoid with the modern versions of Active Directory. So what I'm doing here is giving you an idea of what has come and changed before I get into what we're really looking at. But the key here is, let's take away human error. Let's take away the issue of remembering when and where to change passwords. Let's automate as much as we can and get as much security in there as possible. The idea of us managing a stack of passwords and having a large password vault, which I'm sure most of you do, it's a nightmare and it is no fun. And it can bring a lot of liability when things go down because so when we actually talk about this, there's a lot of options for Active Directory. Are we actually going to use traditional domain controllers? Well, in most cases, the answer is yes. You can go purely cloud and go Azure Active Directory. There's a lot there that you can actually do. That's really not the focus of today. But even with Azure Active Directory, if you like things like group policy objects, where you actually go in and do those minute security settings, it's just easier in Active Directory domain services. So having it on-prem, kind of. There have been many companies where I've actually put those domain controllers in either Azure or AWS. It doesn't matter where your domain controllers are as long as they can talk to your computers. So I would say 90% of my clients today are hybrid, if not more. They're using both Azure AD, SaaS, infrastructure as a service, and on-premise domain controllers, as well as in the cloud domain controllers, actually. So the focus here, though, we like to see, does your environment pass? So there's some very simple standard concepts. So we want to look at replication, your services, time, and your secure channel. So let's go through each of these one at a time. Replication. Replication is when two domain controllers talk to each other. Now, the biggest problem with Active Directory domain services today is it just works. So when you actually are working on a domain controller and it looks like it's working perfectly because you're able to log in, maybe that login's a little slow, but most people don't really complain about an extra 30 seconds or an extra minute logging in the morning. But most of the time it just works. Maybe your time drifts now and then. You don't see it fail unless it fails completely. So the biggest problem, as I said, is Active Directory. It just works. It is so overbuilt that it is protecting your environment. But it means that it doesn't get the care and feeding it usually needs. So when you actually design, and apparently I really like the word actually, I don't know why. When you design a replication scheme for Active Directory, you're dealing with your network link speeds, you're dealing with the update sequence numbers, everything is stamped with a version, stamped with a timestamp, it has a GUID, all the little replicas that are moving around, they are incredibly important to get to where they get because all replication is unidirectional. And this is an area that most people just turn on. So sometimes when it starts breaking, you don't really know where to go to look to find it. So this is kind of the back end of Active Directory. The next piece is when we're actually checking to see if something's a pass. So we look to see if replication's working and how well it's working. Then we go to services and we say, is everything available and appropriate? Is auditing turned on? I don't know how many people realize it, but auditing of Active Directory is something that I have actually maybe seen 5 companies historically have it before I showed up. It's really important because you need to be able to prove what actually happened. You need to see what's happening in your environment. And quite often, it's not set up. But if it's set up, we're doing good. We're passing. Is time correct? So does everybody here know that your computers should have their time managed from the PDC emulator, a FSMA role on an Active Directory domain controller? It's actually the host for all time in AD. And if you notice, it's hierarchical. So all your domain controllers talk to your PDC emulator. Your workstations talk to your PDC. But downstream, child domains, because these are child domains, that's why the big triangle, the PDC emulator only talks to the next PDC emulator. So it's completely hierarchical. That is actually, in fact, when you set time settings, it's called domain hire to make this work. There is a lot that goes behind the scenes on time, and it's the quickest way to destroy a domain or a forest. So this is something that we make sure is working good and clean. We validate if it's a pass, the client to DC communications going well on secure channel. That means the encrypted piece of communication that's actually reset every 30 days on literally a clock on all PCs. DC to DC communications working. DC cross-trust communications working. Do you notice how clients don't actually have that cross communication? They don't. It's literally one of these 3 categories, that's it. Now, when we're assessing an environment, the biggest issue we run into is sometimes there's a failure. I mean, it could be one piece, could be another, but it's a failure. Does the replication work? If it doesn't, it's really something that I would say most of us have dealt with at one time or another. Companies have this happen all the time. It's the user that takes an hour or maybe doesn't show up until the next day to let someone log in. There's always the argument, well, you change your password, it'll be a while before you can use that again. That's not the way it's supposed to work. If your replication is working, that's not the way it works. So if that's happening to you, that's a fail. Are your services appropriate? You know what? Quite often they're not. People end up troubleshooting and things get left out of whack. It's just how it works. So you have to go in and validate that you're not failing on your services side. And that's something that's very important. And of course, like I said earlier, auditing, most people don't turn it on, but it's incredibly important. And you know, have you ever had a clock stop, or more importantly, a watch? You go to check your time on your watch and you go, whoa, wait a minute, this is the wrong time. When that happens on a domain, it shows up on everybody's computer. You get people complaining. It's not uncommon to have employees of a company cracking jokes about how their computer's always off. You don't want that. It's bad PR, and it's bad for communication. In fact, it can do so much damage. I have seen domains literally split into multiple domains over time. So certain users could use this domain controller, so other users could use this domain controller, and the two domain controllers don't talk. And for 180 days, you have two identically named domains. And it does happen. How many of y'all have actually ran into situations where a computer dropped off the domain, all of a sudden we have no idea why? Well, usually it's a secure channel. It happens. We actually went out of our way and created a tool. It's really for SCCM, but one of the things it does is it actually repairs the secure channel. It's a tool called Shark. If you have any time and are interested in that, it also fixes WMI and things like that. It does it every single day, as well as fixing the client and all the supporting services for SCCM. But more importantly, it just fixes stuff like secure channel and WMI. But if this doesn't work, you have lots of computers that don't really exist on the domain anymore, even though they're there, or they're partially controlled, and that's a fail. So we talked about pass and fail. Now I want to give some general concepts. These are concepts that are simple. We're going to talk about the recycle bin, best practice analyzer, and virtualization. This is just to give you an idea of what is actually happening in Active Directory today, and what are the new tools that you have and your team has. So a recycle bin. It sounds really simple, and it is. It gives you that ability to undelete files and users, even application partitions, technically. Anything that's an object can be undeleted. The concept came out in 2008 R2. It was really neat. It was only done in command line, and for some reason, a lot of people don't really like command line. Personally, I'm fine with it, but I started with computers a very long time ago, and there wasn't something called a GUI that anybody had. In fact, I think my first GUI was for the Commodore 64. It was an application called Geos. It's either that or it was a Commodore Amiga, which is technically a predecessor to the Mac. Neat computers, but very long time ago. The other thing is there's a best practice analyzer on every role in a server right now for Windows 2008 R2 and above. So Active Directory has a best practice analyzer. What that is it's actually a GUI or a command line tool. You can do it either way. You click it, you run it, and it gives you an update on how you fall into best practices per Microsoft. That's not something most people had ever seen before this showed up. It was like, wait, there's best practices we can automatically look at? Notice the kind of shocked face on that smiley face? That's how a lot of us look at it. But the funniest thing is, 9 times out of 10, if you go to look at it, no one has ever ran it. If you look at a best practice analyzer on any server, you literally are going through server administrator, server manager. You go to the role, you scroll down to best practice analyzer, it tells you when the last time it was ran. I would say less than 1% of the servers I've seen actually have ever had it ran. Now that's because I see a lot of servers, but you might want to double check if your team is running those. It can save a lot of problems in the future. Next is virtualization. I mentioned earlier, 2012 was the first that was ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services, safe for virtualization. This is a huge deal. Now, if you notice, I'm listing Windows Server 2012 with Hyper-V, Hyper-V server. Yes, there actually is a Hyper-V server. It's free, in case anybody did not know that. Windows 8 Plus, VMware, Workstation, vSphere. Technically, I believe it's now also on Zen for your safety. So there's a lot of changes that have happened, and it's really changed our world. So the problem has always been everything has a timestamp and a USN number based off of it. So the updated serial number. So you take a snapshot, the time changes, you restore the snapshot, it's out of order. So everything that happened from that snapshot corrupted because of the timestamp, everything above it. And all of a sudden, your domain controller is completely corrupt, and you have to actually do a full-on restore. But today, that is no longer the case. You can actually survive that type of error. Next up, we've got single sign-on. Now, understand single sign-on is a huge deal. The funny thing is, you ask everyone, what single sign-on product are you using? I've only ever had one person answer the very first answer that truly makes sense. I'm using Active Directory Domain Services. Guess what? You're right. That's a single sign-on tool. There are many application servers that you are connecting to every single day that you do not do a separate login for. Don't be surprised. That is your first tool. Now, using Azure Active Directory, Azure AD Connects, Active Directory Federation Services, Okta, One Login, it doesn't matter. They all can talk now. Single sign-on is no longer this concept of going, oh, I have a special tool here. No, there are literally hundreds of ways to connect. Just with Active Directory alone, Active Directory Domain Services, it's really common to use LDAP-S, ADFS, Azure AD Connect. Those are all things that you already have at least partial rights to. That's how you're connecting to Office 365. There's no additional charge for that. It's when you start using AD Premium or third-party products, then you start actually adding on some costs. But the reality is they're very minuscule costs. The days of the $100,000 application to give you single sign-on or the $1 million application to give you single sign-on, it's a thing of the past. Instead, we just come to expect it. So for PKI, extending, the first thing I want to talk about is PKI. Sorry, I just love PKI. PKI is public key infrastructure. Some people call it Active Directory Certificate Services. That's the official name from Microsoft, but it's really just PKI. It's how you get certificates. Now, I want everybody to look at this screen. Ansible, SSH, Puppet, Chef, Smart Cards, Windows, System Center, more. There's integration for all of this. There are techniques to use centrally managed PKI. And it's funny because most people think, oh, the most important part of this is I have the ability to encrypt. No. That is not the most important capability. The most important capability for PKI is something that is nicknamed kill points. A kill point is something I can just turn off with the flick of a switch. So in reality, turn off a server, delete a certificate. As soon as I get rid of it, it's disabled. So I can block the ability for an Ansible certificate if it's using my stack. I just say that's dead, and all of a sudden it can't work anymore. Someone wants access to their SSH. I've encrypted the files for their keys. I revoke their ability to see that, or I revoke the certificate, and all of a sudden you can't get there anymore. I can block and stop and actually defend when people should no longer have access. Now, encrypting is huge, don't get me wrong, but you need control, and control is what public key infrastructure gives you. Encryption is another piece of control. I want to make sure that my data doesn't fall into someone else's hands. Microsoft has had a tool, it's been available for a very long time. It's called BitLocker. It is very easy to manage. It can literally integrate the recovery keys into Active Directory, and it locks things up. It locks things up in a way that utilizes a chip on a computer today. So I want to make sure if anybody sees TPM on the laptop order they're doing, don't save $10 and just and uncheck it. You want that TPM chip. But it uses that chip to make the encryption incredibly fast. See, TPM is a cryptographic tool. And even if you don't know if you're going to use it, keep that TPM around because at some point you may have to. Now, in Azure, you've got a lot of tools. These all connect back into Active Directory domain services. Actually, I run some environments purely in Active Directory or in Azure with Active Directory domain services. One of the reasons why the concept of calling something Azure Active Directory is a little complicated, because there are too many ways that can be. But they brought out a new tool called MOMS, or MOM. The funny thing is, there was a Microsoft Operations Manager 2005 that went by the term MOM. Lately, Microsoft has been recycling a lot of their old phrases and their old acronyms. It's kind of scary for those of us who've been around a while. But there's still the child of that protocol that's now called SCOM, and it's SCOM 2016. It can monitor anything. And when I say anything, I've actually seen the management pack where someone got upset and monitored a coffee pot. Well, you can do a lot of this integration and monitoring, log analytics, all in MOM. And in case you didn't know it, there's actually a very low-end version of it because it's all based off storage. That's free. Give it a try. Take a look at it. But you can expand it however deep you want to go. There's automation, but more than that, there's log analytics, update assessments, things like that. Something that actually makes sure that everything's working right. And my most hated phrase, Azure AD. The problem is there's so many different versions, but this is the official one. So Azure AD, when someone says that's usually talking about the AD that's ran by Microsoft in Azure that's used for their cloud identities. So if you have Office 365, you already have Azure AD and you might just not realize it because you have your accounts in the cloud and those are all managed through Azure AD. There's a lot of extensions that can happen there. Don't think yourself limited because you're already probably there. And Azure AD, it connects to stuff. And by the way, it's not just Microsoft. I mean, I'm going to tell you Office 365, Azure itself, but there's lots of other tools. Workday is an example. It connects right into Azure AD. There's a lot of SaaS applications that can as well. If you use Azure AD Premium, it can connect to literally thousands of applications with already set to go packages to do it. So next up, Azure AD Management. Okay, with Azure AD, do you know you can actually join a computer to Azure AD and force the deployment of either Intune or Configuration Manager or both? Actually, you can do a lot of stuff once it's joined in. There's even a new form where you can go in and say, I'm buying the CSP version. That's the Cloud Service Provider version. So that's a month-to-month concept of owning Windows 10, but it also includes a bunch of other stuff. But the key is you have a user, say they work in Dubai. Okay? Now, I need all my employees to run Enterprise Edition. I need BitLocker. I need all the bells and whistles. Okay. Well, shipping a laptop can be a lot of fun. And I'm being very facetious here. Because, say, instead of Dubai, someone's in India and you're a deli shop. So I grab my brand new Latitude and I ship it to my employee in India. What I didn't check was, are there any parts made in Mexico in my laptop that I just shipped? Oh, wait, there was. Well, India and Mexico, last I checked, are still in a bit of a trade war. So as soon as you ship in that laptop, it gets stuck in customs. So they don't get that computer. That's not a good thing. So the reality is, with the subscription, they go to a store, they go to their local Staples or equivalent, they grab a laptop, they take it home, they register it to Azure Active Directory and put it in their upgrade key, and the computer reinstalls itself. It's now part of your Azure Active Directory domain. You can have it set up to give you a VPN, connect in, and now it joins to the domain, installs Configuration Manager. You're totally under MDM, and that user is part of the domain, encrypted, and you are ready to go, and you never shipped them the computer. They just went to the store and bought it. Huge change, all because of Azure. So, additionally, Azure has things like multi-factor authentication. Okay. There's an on-premise version. There's a cloud-based version. The on-premise can manage cloud. However, you do have to really play with ADFS to make it work right. And there's a lot of third-party ADFS or MFAs as well. MFA is multi-factor authentication. Just one of those things we want to keep an eye on. It changes the world when you have that ability. By the way, one warning about multi-factor authentication: everybody likes to connect it to Active Directory. Please be cautious. If you have 20 SaaS applications and you actually have someone type in their 4 to 16-digit key at the end of every time they use it, you can become the most hated IT infrastructure you'll ever want to be. So be very cautious and not overdoing MFA. Once again, single sign-on, there's ADFS, Azure App Proxy, Azure Active Directory. Those are all versions of single sign-on. Now, I wrote multi-modern management. Now, my problem with modern management is people are thinking it's better than traditional, and then they look at traditional as very old school. The problem is traditional IT isn't as old school as are being listed here, okay? So traditionally, you have a single device. That's really common. Modern IT, multiple devices. The problem there is traditional IT is already dealing with some of these same issues. The business-owned devices versus users-owned devices, corporate legacy versus cloud management or managed apps. There's a lot of talk about traditional is not up to date. It's not automated. It's reactive. It's high touch. I'm going to tell you it doesn't have to be. Modern management never is those things. So the reality is you're usually ending up with a mix. So if you have SCCM, you've already made the right step to get away from the old school traditional. But modern IT is a little bit different. And when they talk modern IT, they're talking about modern management, which is completely MDM-based, cloud-based management. So if you look here at your tools, the traditional side's on the left. So you've got your custom corporate image, your SCCM, your Masseuse, your local network connections, your Azure AD and Active Directory, your basic security tools. Now in the cloud, you've got advanced threat protection, you've got Azure AD. This is the concept for a new startup. Could go completely Intune-based in Azure Active Directory and never need a domain if they're very small. The reality is nearly everything Actually, no. Everything on the right side of the screen could actually be managed by traditional IT. So you need to pick and choose how much work you want to do manually and how much you want to just use the easy, simple management concepts that are coming out with modern management. Here's the concept that you really have to look at when you're dealing with AD as well as all these other services that connect to it. The modern workplace, you're working from anywhere. You're bringing and choosing your devices, at least some of them. You may have a corporate laptop, but it's quite often that you're going to be working on a tablet or a cell phone. That's bring your own. Now, that's not always the case, but by and large, it really is common. You want your self-service. The concept of purely cloud, it's all integrated cloud solutions. Sometimes that works out. Sometimes it becomes part of the modern workplace. But the reality is your entire goal is to cut your costs. So let's lower that total cost of ownership. When we're talking about lowering cost, we really want to talk about workflow automation, okay? Now, there are 3 different versions of workflow automation on this picture. System Center Orchestrator, it's a brute. It is by far the most powerful tool that Microsoft has released. It is absolutely amazing what it can do, and don't ever doubt that the capabilities can improve your company. One of the things that we've actually done with this, so everyone always hears about System Center, right? But we've done neat stuff. So System Center Orchestrator, here's my neatest concept that we did. And this is something Managed Solution has done, not something some other company or Microsoft did out on a specialty event. So we took Orchestrator and we said, hey, this company needs help. They onboard too many people. They're growing rapidly. They were actually bringing in 10, 20 new users a week. That's huge, explosive growth. So they came to us and said, we need help. So we gave them Orchestrator. And what it did was simple. New employee shows up. They go into HR. HR puts in their name, what they're doing, checks a bunch of boxes, puts in the room number they're at. Saves it to a directory. That directory takes the file, feeds it into Orchestrator, and deletes it. Kicks off a bunch of tasks. In SCCM, it started the imaging of a laptop. In AD, it provisioned the user. In VMM, Virtual Machine Manager, it gave development credits, which were credits they could use to build virtual machines if they needed them. In Skype for Business, it created a phone number and registered it to the new Active Directory account. In Office 365, it created and provisioned the email account, SharePoint access. And then at the very end, when that image was built, that new computer was built, it emailed the help desk to come grab the computer with the information for the user, their temporary password, and the computer number. So they went in, found the computer with that serial number, picked it up. They went to the door. Hello, I have a computer. It's for Danielle Harma. I want to give this to you. Here's your new password. It's all ready to go. I hope you have a nice day. Welcome to the company. And the help desk person left. This all happened in the hour they're filling out paperwork. Keep things simple. Microsoft OMS, otherwise known as MOMS. That's the tool I talked about earlier. Microsoft Flow. Microsoft Flow is a bit of a double-edged sword. You got to make sure that your staff looks at it who's doing support, but it gives the automation capabilities to the end user. Incredible change in direction. So we've talked about a lot of things here, but the reality is the first thing you need to know, does your AD, your Active Directory domain service, does it pass or fail? We actually created an accelerator for that. If this is something that you need, slow login times, computer droppings on and off, computer time not accurate, name resolution failing. That name resolution failing, that can be a pain because you can have two domain controllers with two completely different sets of DNS, even though it's Active Directory integrated if there's a replication problem. The intermittent unexplainable errors, that reminds me of a little blog I wrote. It was actually a little short snippet, but I called it The Ghosts of Domain Controllers Past. And it was about how the computers, it's like you're going clickety-clack on your keyboard, but you don't really know what's going to happen. Users and groups taking forever to get in. I mean, went into a company and found out that it was 72 hours for a user to be provisioned. What's the user supposed to do for those 3 first days? We want to make sure that we can help you get through this. So we have this accelerator, and if you notice, it's cheap. All we're looking at is pass or fail. Does it have issues? We're not coming in there and saying, hey, let's go fix everything right now. No, we really want to go in and say, did it work? Does it work? Does it pass? Does it fail? And move on from there. So if you ever have a question about your domain, hopefully you don't get the smiley face on the right because, I mean, getting an F, that's just horrible. And that is actually it for my presentation. Did anyone have any questions?
Thanks very much, Rob. I don't see any questions coming in yet. Let's see. All right. Well, thank you. We will follow up with all attendees with the recording too, and if you have questions arise, we can answer them then.
All right. Have a great one, everyone.
Happy holidays.